Hello and welcome to the Neuro Rich podcast. My name is Farshad,
And I'm Maya.
and today we have some exciting research to tell you guys about. So, Maya, what are we looking at here today?
So, we're going to talk about the gut microbiota and how that relates to obesity. It's a pretty. So, if someone would ask, if you were asked something like that, um, like let's say Farshad, I asked you, what does gut microbiota have to do with obesity? Would you say it has something to do with it?
Uh, Great question to bring up. First, let me explain what is gut microbiota.
Great idea.
So, biologists define it as the totality of microorganisms, bacteria, viri, protozoa, fungi, things that basically have genetic material living inside of our body, specifically our gastrointestinal tract. And this area harbors these microbiota to digest food that otherwise our bodies would not be able to process. So we're giving them shelter, they're giving us energy and material that is the building blocks to our bodies.
So it's like we've hired these microorganisms, right? Like they're like labor. They're doing this labor for us. They're making stuff. They're making like amino acids that we can't make. They're making vitamins that we can't make, and they're breaking down food products that we can't break down in exchange for what we can give them, which is pretty neat, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like endangered servitude. So we've locked them in
We've locked them in against their will, and they're
100%, and they're stuck there doing work for us. It's the perfect setup.
we're indebted to them, like, you want to digest your vegetables. You like vegetables. You want to digest them. Well, you can't digest them on your own. The bacteria are doing it for you.
But the important thing here is that the composition of the microbiota here affects our bodies and how our bodies are intaking energy. So, from person to person, the gut microbiota varies. This is important. Why? Because the energy that our body intakes is to some capacity dependent on the composition of the gut microbiota. And that affects how the food is processed and also how much energy we gain from the food that we intake. Now, this becomes relevant when we define what obesity is. So, Maya, tell me how the researchers in the paper we're going to look at later today define obesity specifically.
All right. So what the researchers have defined obesity as so they what they said is that obesity, they recognize it as a multifactorial disorder. Basically, it's the interaction between the individual and the environment. And what happens is that when the energy intake, or how much food someone consumes, is actually higher than the energy that they use up over time. So that is their definition of obesity, and this ties back to what Farshad said earlier about how the diversity of the microbiota affects how much energy you need, because some microbes need more energy than others, right? So if you have a lot of microbiota in your intestines but these microbiota are the ones of the species that need a lot of energy, you're going to need to take in a lot of energy to satiate these bacteria. But if they're of the species that don't require a lot of energy, you don't need to eat as much, and that's difference in person to person that makes everyone's expenditure and intake of energy unique. The idea behind it is basically that if someone has a lot of the microbiota species that need a lot of energy, so they intake more than they let out, that means there's some sort of direct association to obesity, and that's the idea. That's the hypothesis there, and that's what the researchers are trying to look at.
So, knowing that, then introduce the paper we're looking at today so we can go into their findings.
Yeah, of course. So what we have here is basically the paper itself is called The Gut Microbiome Profile in Obesity, a systematic review. It was done by Castaner et al. In around 2018. So a systematic review, basically, it's a systematic paper. So what they do, the researchers take a bunch of papers. They took papers over the last 5 years. These papers in the last 5 years go over around the same field. They involve gut microbiome profile, and they involve the relationship of that profile to obesity. What these researchers are trying to look at is they're taking these papers and they're trying to find out whether or not, what we said before, obesity is associated with more or less microbiota diversity in the gut, and whether the composition of the microbiota changes with the case of obesity. So they took 15 studies. They took 11 studies for lean versus obese. So they took, like, let's say this person who is lean, let's check their diversity compared to this individual who is obese. And they took 11 papers from there, and they took 4 papers from bariatric surgery and how that affects microbiota. Like, let's say someone does a gastric bypass, and when someone does a gastric bypass, they lose weight really quickly because you're basically cutting off an entire portion of the stomach, right? So you cut that, and then you drastically lose weight. So does that or does that not change the diversity of microbiota? And that's what they're looking at. Oh, one more thing. Let me add something really quick. I forgot to add. So, when people vary, when people's like microbiota composition varies from person to person, it doesn't only just vary from person to person. It can actually change based on your diet. If you start eating, like if you change diets, like for example, like, oh, I'm eating mostly fish, and then I start eating mostly vegetables, and then a little bit of like red meat, right? My gut microbiota is going to change. Like there's like it changes really quickly. Really, it's very dynamic. It's not like static. It's not, you're not going to have the same microbiota composition for the rest of your life. So that's why the bariatric surgery stuff is really important, because it's not just, it's checking the same microbiota composition for the same person, trying to see if it changes and how that affects obesity. So that's pretty cool. Now, what these researchers found was actually something really controversial. So, Farshad, you know all about this. How about you? Take it away. What did they find?
So they had a series of findings, and one of the things that they found was that in previous papers, there was a sense that for whatever reason, obese individuals have a less diverse microbiota than say lean individuals, and for some reason that may have been contributing to their obesity situation. What these researchers found over looking at the 11 papers that they looked at was that may not necessarily be the case as far as we're concerned with the upper gastrointestinal tract, right? And their reasoning for that was perhaps the gastrointestinal tract in its upper portion is not even a place to harbor that many bacteria in the first place. And as we go further down towards the more distal side of the gastrointestinal tract, then we get a higher diversity. Now, again, uh, this lack of difference could be simply associated with the fact that there isn't enough evidence here to go off of. But for the most part, over the 11 papers that these researchers looked at, they came to a conclusion that there isn't that much difference. They also noticed, and this is where it gets interesting, that between weight discordant twins, so these are twins that one is obese and the other is lean, there is also not a significant difference between their gut microbiota diversity. And also in children that have varying obesity profiles, their gut microbiota is more or less not that different. So overall, we can't really say that the diversity affects obesity as much as other research may point to reasons against this. Now, however, something that they did figure out, and this, for me at least, was the most impressive and interesting part of this research, was that bariatric surgery uh, does lead to increased gut microbiota. And you might be thinking, how could this be possible? That was my question, right? When I was looking at this research, I realized When we looked into this, we realized that by portioning off a segment of the stomach or cutting it off altogether, what ends up happening is that there will be less amount of food that goes into the stomach, as we already know, but this results in the parietal cells being triggered less often, and them there being less of them to be triggered. So the content of hydrochloric acid in the stomach decreases, which leads to a lower acidity. Meaning what? Meaning that more bacteria would be able to resist and survive the harsh conditions of the stomach. This has a few effects, one being that more of these bacteria are able to get passed down to the more distal segments of the gastrointestinal tract and colonize there. But this was a question that came up for me personally. Would there be an effect on, let's say, the overall health of the individual chronically? So maybe we don't want certain bacteria or certain viri or certain fungi to actually survive the stomach acidity and then go on and colonize our colon, right?
Yeah, it seemed to cause a lot of like immune problems, right? Because a lot of the things like because a lot of the times I've heard that like because it's incredibly acidic in the stomach, right? Like if you like eat something that's probably like rotten or something that you don't want there, normally the stomach would take care of it, right? The food stays a long time in the stomach. The the hydrochloric acid in the stomach has enough time to completely kill the bacteria, and whatever survives is just already used to acidic conditions in the first place. So with like gastric bypass or like another form of gastric surgery where like a part of the stomach would be cut off and not used, like what does that do, right? Like like are they is it more likely that someone would get an ulcer, for example? Like do they have higher tendencies of ulcers? Do they have like a greater risk of stomach flu, like stuff like that, right? That's a really good question, not gonna lie.
Yes, so more studies have to be done to figure out exactly what the long term effects of gastric bypass would be, specifically in terms of the gut microbiota composition. Now, having gone through this study, I want Maya for us to make the conclusion and give us a summary of what we found.
So this paper was like really short, right? It was just like so if you look at the paper, we'll have it linked in the description if anyone is interested in reading it through. But the paper was like a lot of like data comparisons. They used significant values to determine whether there is a correlation between all these papers. And basically what happened was that they compared the lean and obese separately from the bariatric. So what they found was like, well, people assume that it's a like the researchers in the papers that they have brought out, they say that there is a difference, right? Like people who are obese have a different gut composition than people who are lean. That is true, but it's an association that they're different. But there's no reason that obesity causes this difference. There's not enough information in any of these papers.
Or vice versa for that matter. We
Yeah,
don't
like
know that.
we don't know because there's not enough information. Like even though like generally like it's considered like true that the gut microbiota changes are associated with, there's not enough evidence to assume it, and that's really important considering that they've like this is really well studied for the last 5 years, and they only looked at 11 out of like what 80 papers they started looking at. They looked at 80 papers from different countries, and they only picked 11 out of those, and they couldn't find a correlation between those 11, which is something to be sure. But they did find a correlation between the bariatric surgery ones. That's definitely it. They found one. They found a correlation between those, and that's the interesting part. So they attribute the difference with lean versus obese to like the fact that it's multifactorial. Like they even when even during the definition of obesity, it is a multifactorial disorder. That's what they said. So there's a lot of factors. The factors are like, of course,
Some of them are unknown, some of them can't be known, and we don't know whether or not some are known or not known.
Exactly. Yeah. There's so much. There's even a problem with data management because a lot of these use an
Hmm.
old version of data management called shotgun sequencing.
But these days we have full genome sequencing that takes care of these diversity calculations.
Yeah. So okay. So hold on one second, Fresh. Now, what do you think? Like, this is really cool. Like, I've heard like numerous times that like, oh, obesity has a factor on gut microbiota, and this paper like doesn't like says right now it's just saying the opposite, saying that there's not enough information. How do you think about this?
I'm of the belief that I think first of all, and this is my opinion, I think our food does impact our microbiota diversity. That has been established. I don't know if the obesity causes a different composition or different compositions cause obesity. That much we don't know. And I think this paper leads more evidence towards the direction that we should study and pursue and research, right? Now, as far as the gastric bypass, I find it really cool that it changes the composition and it increases diversity of microbiota. I would like to see researchers, as I said before, looking into the chronic effects of this because that's really important.
Definitely. I just think bariatric surgery as like a research method, not gonna lie. Like it is really interesting because like of course when you test lean versus obese with different people, like I mean, we've already established that the gut microbiota varies from person to person and it changes. There's not much comparison that you can do between different people, but bariatric surgery is between the same person. It's the same person. And that's important, right? And like same person studies seem like I feel that it would be more concrete if it's the same person because it accounts for so many like differences that could cause like, oh, there's not enough information because there really isn't. Like if you think about it, right? This is what I think, right? Like I think that like if they just use like same person studies, like they might just get more concrete results. And with how research techniques are evolving over time, like who knows? Maybe in the next few years they might have figured out something. Who knows, right?
100%. I'm also interested to see uh, more the research on probacteria that a lot of people these days take, right? How is that impacting the whole situation with weight management and also the actual diversity of our guts? Is it even impacting it, right? Because these probacteria, they go through the stomach again. uh, do they make it through or not? Do they even get a chance to colonize, right? And how does our food intake affect that composition in the end? With that said, I want to wrap up the episode today. So if you have any general comments, leave it in the comment section below. Uh, with that said, I'll pass it to Maya to sign off on the podcast. And thank you so much for listening to us.
Yeah, thanks for lending your ears to our humble little podcast. It is our first episode. We hope that you stick around and hope that you're just as interested in what we're going to cover as we are. We're really happy sharing all these papers with you guys. So, yeah, see you guys in the next episode. Have a great one.